There is a moment that happened inside the Obsidian Court on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, and I want you to understand what it meant before I tell you how it came to be. The court was full. It was a formal session, one of the quarterly proceedings in which Emperor Valdric reviewed the petitions of the outer provinces. There were perhaps 200 people in that hall, lords and ministers and ambassadors and scribes and attendants. 200 people who knew the customs and protocols of the Obsidian Court, who had spent years learning its rhythms and its rules and its particular silences. Every single one of them went still when Sorath bowed. Sorath was not the kind of dragon that bowed. Sorath had not bowed to anyone in 300 years of living. 300 years is a very long time. In 300 years, Sorath had witnessed the reign of 7 emperors. Sorath had watched empires shift their borders. Sorath had been present at the founding of the Obsidian Court itself, and Sorath had never bowed to any person who stood on those stones. The bow was not small. Sorath did not incline her head in a gesture of acknowledgement. She lowered her entire massive body, which was the color of deep water before a storm, down toward the floor until her chin nearly touched the polished obsidian tiles. Her great wings folded in against her sides. Her eyes, which were amber and ancient, and had seen 3 centuries of human lives pass like seasons, closed briefly, and then opened again. Everyone in that hall understood what they were seeing. Everyone, that is, except for Vesper. Vesper was standing near the far side of the hall with her translation ledger open in her hands, and she was looking at Sorath with an expression of quiet concern. To Vesper, a dragon lowering itself to the floor looked like an animal that might be in pain. Vesper was thinking about whether she should go and check on the dragon. Vesper was wondering whether that was appropriate, given the formal proceedings. Vesper did not know what a dragon's bow meant. The court knew. Every lord and minister and ambassador in that room knew exactly what they were witnessing. They knew the history of it. They knew the weight of it, and they looked from Sorath down toward the floor, following the line of that ancient bow, to see who it was directed at. It was directed at a foreign translator, who was quietly worried about whether Sorath had pulled a muscle. Emperor Valdric stood at the head of the proceedings and watched without changing his expression, but his hands, which were clasped behind his back in the posture he always maintained in formal sessions, tightened slightly. Only someone who knew Valdric very well would have noticed. No one in that room knew Valdric that well. That was something he had been very careful about for 20 years. This is the story of how that morning came to be. It begins not with a dramatic event, but with small, ordinary moments that accumulated without anyone quite noticing them accumulate. Valdric had been ruling the Obsidian Court for 20 years, and in those 20 years he had built something that most emperors only dream of. He had built a system that worked. He had done it through a specific method. Valdric believed that most failures in governance came not from bad intentions, but from unpredictability, from the variance that human emotion introduced into otherwise sound structures. He had watched his predecessor, Emperor Harion, allow personal loyalty to override policy judgment 3 times in 8 years. Each time the results had been poor. Valdric, who was then a young minister in the court, had made a decision about how he would rule if he ever had the chance. He would remove the variance. The Obsidian Court under Valdric ran on written procedure. Every petition had a process. Every ruling had a precedent. Every appointment was made through a scoring system he had designed himself. The ministers who worked under Valdric knew exactly what to expect. They knew his priorities. They knew his standards. They knew that if they did their work according to the established method, they would receive the established result. This was not a small thing. Many of those ministers had served under Harion, whose court had been a place of constant anxiety, because no one ever knew what Harion would decide from day to day. Valdric's court was different. Valdric's court was stable. What Valdric had not examined was what he had lost in the process. The system worked. The provinces were stable. He had metrics for everything he measured, and the metrics were good. He had no metric for loneliness, so he did not notice that he had it. Valdric was 38 years old. He was precise in his dress and his manner and his speech. He had dark eyes and close-cropped dark hair, and the posture of someone trained from childhood to occupy space without sprawling into it. He was not unkind. His ministers would have said he was fair. They would have been correct. They would not have said they understood him. Because Valdric had removed variance from his relationships in the same way he had removed it from his governance. He knew exactly how close to let people come before the relationship became something that could introduce unpredictability. He had calibrated that distance very precisely over 20 years. Sorath had always been the one exception, not because Valdric had chosen it, but because Sorath was 300 years old and had outlived every attempt anyone had ever made to calibrate their relationship with her. Sorath simply existed in whatever way Sorath chose to exist. Valdric had stopped trying to manage this when he was 26. He thought of it as a minor personal failing. He had not understood that it was the most honest relationship he had. The people of the Obsidian Court had a saying about Sorath that the older attendants still repeated to younger ones. The saying was, "Do not try to read the dragon. Sorath would not be read." Most dragons, in the stories the court told itself, were creatures of appetite and power. They responded to dominance hierarchies. They could be understood, with patience and careful study, as operating on principles of interest and self-preservation. Sorath did not operate on those principles. Or rather, Sorath operated on principles that were her own, and she had had 300 years to develop them, and they were not simple. She had watched the court change. She had watched lords who were arrogant in their power become small in their age. She had watched modest ministers outlast the lords who dismissed them. She had a strong preference for people who were simply doing their work without performing it. Sorath did not explain herself. What the court knew about Sorath's bow was this. There were old records in the court library from the first decades of the Obsidian Court's existence. In those records, there were 2 documented instances of Sorath bowing. The first was at the funeral of a stable attendant named Paris, who had cared for the court's horses for 40 years, and who had also, without ever making a point of it, left food and water for Sorath at consistent intervals throughout her service. Sorath had lowered herself to the ground at the funeral and held the position until the ceremony was complete. The second was at the birth of the emperor's daughter 2 centuries ago, when the child had been brought to the courtyard at 3 days old. Sorath had bowed then as well. That daughter grew up to become the court's most celebrated minister of justice. She had died at 92, still in service. The pattern, if you looked at it carefully across 200 years of distance, was not about rank. Sorath had bowed to a stable attendant and to an infant. The records offered no analysis. What the court also knew, and what Vesper did not know, was that Sorath's bow constituted a formal recognition. By ancient treaty and custom, it meant that Sorath found this person worthy of her attention, worthy of her protection. In the old tradition, it meant that Sorath was placing this person under the court's highest guarantee of safety. No emperor had ever overruled it. No emperor had ever tried. The bow had not happened in 300 years. Until a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Until Vesper. Vesper had come to the Obsidian Court 3 years ago as a junior translator, and in 3 years, she had become something that courts are very good at producing. A person who is necessary but invisible. She was 29. She had grown up in the monastery of the White Ledge, a place of learning and manuscripts and 11 resident scholars who between them spoke 14 languages. Vesper had been left at the monastery at the age of 4, by parents who were traveling merchants, and who had not returned for her. The scholars had not particularly known what to do with a child, but they had known what to do with an eager reader. They had treated her as a student, and she had learned what there was to learn. By the time she was 19, she had mastered 5 languages, the court's common tongue, the southern coastal dialect, the formal written language of the eastern provinces, the old mountain tongue of the border regions, and the formal diplomatic script of the northern nations. She was developing a 6th when the monastery burned. The fire started in the night. It moved fast. Vesper had gotten out with the clothes she was sleeping in and her personal journal, which she had grabbed by instinct because she had always slept with it nearby. She had lost the manuscripts. She had lost the library. She had lost 4 of the 11 scholars. What Vesper did in the years after was what she called reconstruction. She sat down, in whatever shelter was available, and wrote down everything she could remember, every text she had studied, every grammatical rule, every vocabulary list. She worked from memory for 4 years, writing and rewriting, because the act of writing consolidated the memory, and reviewing what she had written identified the gaps. She ended up with 31 journals. When she arrived at the Obsidian Court with those journals, and her 5 languages, and her translator's certificate, she was told she would be starting at the most junior level. She said that was fine. She was assigned to the overflow translation desk. She worked efficiently and accurately. She was promoted, quietly, twice. She was now the senior junior translator, which meant she was trusted but not yet important. At court, translators were furniture. This was not a cruel arrangement, it was a practical one. Translators needed to be present in proceedings without having a presence that distorted the dynamics. Vesper was very good at this. She had been making herself unobtrusive in shared spaces since she was 4 years old. She had 3 journals now filled with observations from her years in the Obsidian Court. None of it was political. Most of it was the kind of noticing that has no particular use. The way Lord Aaron's left hand moved when he was unhappy with a ruling. The particular quality of silence in the hall when Emperor Valdric entered. The way Sorath watched from the high gallery, and what she seemed to watch for. Vesper had been writing about Sorath for 6 months, before Sorath noticed Vesper at all. The quality that Sorath had been looking for over 3 centuries was not easy to name. She had spent a long time trying. It was not courage, though people who had it often had courage. It was not intelligence, though they usually had that too. It was not kindness, though they were generally kind in ways that were genuine rather than performed. The closest Sorath had come to a name for it was the ones who see what is actually there. Most people in the Obsidian Court saw a version of the court filtered through what the court had told them they were seeing. They saw rank and protocol and the performance of power, and they navigated that performance skillfully. But they were not seeing the thing itself. They were seeing the representation. Vesper saw differently. Sorath had been watching Vesper for 4 months with increasing attention, and in that time, she had identified the specific quality of Vesper's observation. Vesper watched without agenda. She was not watching the court to find advantage in what she saw. She was not building a picture of the court that would serve her ambition or her security. She was simply watching because she was genuinely curious about what was actually happening in front of her, and she wrote it down so she could think about it more carefully later. This was rarer than it should have been. Sorath had lived 300 years, and she could count on her claws the people she had known who watched the world this way. There was also a second thing. Sorath had noticed that Vesper was the only person in the court who looked at Sorath herself, rather than at the idea of Sorath. The ministers and lords looked at Sorath and saw the symbol of the court's power, the creature whose presence legitimized the throne. They were looking at a symbol. Vesper looked at Sorath and seemed to be actually wondering about her, what she was thinking, what she found interesting, whether she was comfortable. Sorath had first noticed Vesper during a session in which a provincial lord had been rude to his own interpreter, a young man named Bren, who had turned red and continued his work without flinching. Sorath had watched Bren for several minutes. Then her gaze had moved along the colonnade and found Vesper, who was at that moment writing something in her ledger with a small private smile. Vesper had been writing, "The Lord does not know that Bren speaks his home dialect fluently, and has been providing the most courteous possible translations of some quite discourteous instructions for the past quarter hour." Sorath had looked at Vesper for a long time after that. In 6 months of observation, Sorath had never seen Vesper perform anything. She had seen Vesper make small adjustments of courtesy because she thought they were right, not because anyone was watching. She had seen Vesper return a falling ledger to a younger translator without making the younger translator feel embarrassed about dropping it. She had seen Vesper ask a senior minister whether her translation of a difficult passage was correct, when she could simply have delivered it and moved on. Vesper was not performing being good. She simply was how she was, whether anyone was watching or not. This was exactly the thing. This was what Sorath had been waiting to see again for 3 centuries. The first time Vesper noticed that Sorath had moved in her direction, she was in the eastern corridor of the court complex, making her way from the translation office to the main archives. It was mid-morning, between formal sessions. The corridor was mostly empty. Vesper heard a sound behind her that was large and slow and deliberate, and she turned around. Sorath was following her down the corridor. Not quickly, not threateningly, simply walking, in the unhurried way of something that has decided it would like to go in a particular direction and sees no reason to be subtle about it. Vesper stopped. Sorath stopped. They looked at each other. Vesper said, "Good morning." She had said it before she could think about whether that was the appropriate thing to say to an ancient dragon who was following her down a corridor. It was simply the thing she said when she encountered someone. Sorath regarded her for a moment. Then Sorath continued down the corridor, moving past Vesper at a pace that was almost companionable, and turned left at the junction toward the outer courtyard. Vesper watched Sorath go. Then she continued to the archives. She wrote about it that evening. "Sorath followed me down the east corridor this morning. I said good morning. I am not sure what the correct protocol for this situation is. I do not think there is a protocol. I should probably ask someone. I suspect no one will know." She did not ask anyone. But the next morning, when she was walking to the archives again, she said good morning to the high gallery where Sorath was resting, without looking up. She heard from above a low sound that was not quite a rumble and not quite a breath. She noted this in her journal as, "Sorath acknowledged the greeting." Possibly. Over the next 3 weeks, Sorath followed Vesper on 5 occasions. Each time was in a different part of the complex, and at a different time of day. Each time, Vesper said good morning or good afternoon, depending on the time, and continued doing what she was doing. She did not change her behavior or her route. She simply acknowledged the dragon's presence, the way she would acknowledge any other person in the same space, and got on with her work. The court had noticed by the 2nd week, ministers and attendants who happened to be in the corridors had stopped and stared, and then murmured to each other afterward. Several senior ministers had a quiet conversation about what it meant, and arrived at no useful conclusion. Emperor Valdric had been told about it by his chief minister on a Thursday afternoon. He had listened with his usual composed expression. He had said, "Keep me informed." He had then spent the rest of Thursday thinking about it, with considerably more attention than his expression had suggested. The quarterly formal session of autumn was the largest of the year. All 4 provincial lords were present, along with their full delegations. There were ambassadors from 3 of the northern nations. The hall was as full as it ever became, and all the formal braziers were lit, and the obsidian tiles had been polished until they reflected the light from above like dark water. Vesper was in her position near the side colonnade. She had her official ledger and her personal journal, the latter kept in her coat pocket. She had brought it without thinking, the way she always brought it. The session began at the 9th hour. Emperor Valdric presided from the high dais, standing with his hands clasped behind him, and his expression clear and unreadable. The first 3 petitions were from southern provinces, and required no translation. Vesper watched and wrote small notes. Sorath was in the high gallery. Vesper could see her if she looked up at a particular angle. Vesper looked up at that angle perhaps once every quarter hour, as she always did. This was not a conscious habit. It had become automatic. The 4th petition was from a northern ambassador, and it required translation. Vesper's supervisor signaled her forward. She moved from the colonnade to the center of the floor, where the ambassador stood, and positioned herself at the appropriate distance to render the translation clearly to both the ambassador and the emperor. The ambassador presented his petition in the northern formal register, which was elaborate and indirect, full of honorifics and conditional phrasing that had to be carefully rendered into the court's direct language without losing the political texture underneath. Vesper translated. She was most of the way through the ambassador's petition when she heard a sound from the high gallery that was different from Sorath's usual gallery sounds. It was deeper, more deliberate. She finished the sentence she was translating before she looked up. Sorath was no longer in the gallery. Sorath was on the floor. She had descended the gallery stairs and was now walking, slowly and with great deliberateness, toward the center of the floor where Vesper was standing. 200 people had gone still. Vesper looked at Sorath. Sorath looked at Vesper. And then Sorath lowered herself, her full body, down to the polished obsidian tiles, wings folded, chin nearly touching the floor. Vesper's first thought was concern. The dragon seemed to be in distress. She looked at the large amber eyes, which were open and calm and looking directly at her, and revised her assessment. Not distress. Something else. She did not have the word for what she was seeing. She looked around. The quality of silence in the hall told her she was missing information. 200 faces were turned toward her, with expressions ranging from shock to wonder, to something she could not interpret at all. She looked at Emperor Valdric. His face was composed, but his eyes were on her with an intensity she had never seen in his face before, through many formal sessions. She did not know what the intensity meant. She looked back at Sorath. She said, quietly, "Are you all right?" Sorath made the low sound that Vesper had come to think of as acknowledgement. Then Sorath rose, smoothly and without haste, and walked back to the gallery stairs. The formal session concluded within the hour. Emperor Valdric brought the proceedings to a precise and proper close and dismissed the assembly with the customary formal words. What happened in the corridors immediately afterward was not customary. The lords and ministers and ambassadors did not disperse in their usual patterns. They gathered in clusters, in the side corridors and the outer courtyard and the formal reception rooms, and they spoke to each other in low, urgent voices. They spoke about what they had seen. They spoke about what it meant. The oldest members of the court, the ones who had read deeply in the court archives over years of service, knew the records. They knew about the stable attendant named Perez. They knew about the infant daughter, 2 centuries ago. They had spent years in an institution that revered its own history, and now they were watching that history come alive in a way none of them had expected to see in their lifetimes. A dragon's bow was not a casual gesture. It was not an accident of posture. It was, in the oldest understanding of the treaty between this court and Sorath's kind, a declaration. Sorath was declaring that this person had her recognition, her regard. In the ancient language of the treaty, the word used was closer to chosen than to recognized, which had always made the scholars uncomfortable because they could not fully explain what the choosing meant. It seemed to mean, of all the people Sorath had assessed across 3 centuries of living, this person had whatever quality Sorath was looking for. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry once wrote, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." He meant that the things which matter most in a life are often the things that formal observation misses entirely. The Obsidian Court had procedures and precedents, and centuries of documented protocol. What it had been looking at, in all that time, was the visible surface of things. Sorath had spent 300 years looking at something the court's formal observation could not quite reach. The lords discussed what it meant for court protocols. The ambassadors discussed what it meant for diplomatic standing. The senior ministers discussed what it meant for Valdric's governance. None of them, in any of these discussions, talked about what it meant for Vesper. Because Vesper was furniture. The bow had been directed at furniture. This was the part that was hardest to process. Valdric was still standing at the high dais after the hall had emptied. He was not thinking about protocol or governance or diplomatic implications. He was thinking about the expression on Vesper's face when she had looked around the hall and seen everyone staring. She had not looked frightened. She had not looked pleased. She had looked, with great precision and genuine curiosity, as though she was trying to understand what she was missing, what information she didn't have. She had looked like someone who trusted that there was a rational explanation and was quietly working to find it, without distress, without performance. Valdric had been removing variance from his life for 20 years, but he had not anticipated watching Sorath bow to someone who did not know what the bow meant, and feeling something that had no place in his system, and no metric, and no established procedure. He wanted to be the one to explain it to her. Vesper was in the translation office, writing up the formal record of the Northern ambassador's petition, when there was a knock at the door. This was unusual. People did not knock at the translation office. They sent requests through the official channel. She said, "Come in," without looking up, because she was in the middle of a sentence, and she had a rule about finishing sentences before she addressed interruptions. When she finished the sentence and looked up, Emperor Valdric was standing in the doorway of the translation office. Vesper stood. She was aware, in a distant way, that she had ink on her left hand from the pen she had been using, and that this was probably not the condition in which one received an emperor. She filed this observation and set it aside. Valdric said, "May I come in?" he asked. Vesper noted this. An emperor did not need to ask to come into a room in his own court. He had asked anyway. She said, "Of course." She moved around the desk to clear a chair, because the chair across from the desk had her coat draped over it, and her 3 journals stacked on the seat. She moved the coat and the journals to the windowsill. Valdric came into the office and sat down. Vesper sat back behind the desk. She folded her hands. She waited. Valdric looked at her for a moment. He looked like a person who had prepared something to say, and had now arrived at the moment of saying it, and was making a small internal adjustment. This was the first time she had seen him make any internal adjustment that was visible from the outside. She found this interesting. He said, "You did not know what Sorath's bow meant." It was not a question. Vesper said, "No, I didn't. I thought she might be in pain." She paused. "I should probably explain that I've been watching Sorath for 6 months, and I'd noticed that she seems to watch for something specific in people. I wasn't sure what. I thought perhaps she was unwell." Valdric said, "She wasn't unwell." Vesper said, "I understand that now." She paused again. "What does it mean?" He told her. He told her about the treaty, about the stable attendant and the infant, 2 centuries apart, about what the court records said, and what the scholars had argued about for generations. He told it precisely and clearly, the way he told everything, but she noticed that he was telling it in a way that was slightly more than just the facts. He was telling her how he had felt, standing at the head of the hall, watching Sorath descend the gallery stairs. He didn't say that directly, but it was in the telling. When he finished, Vesper was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I said good morning to her every day for 6 months. That's all I did. I didn't do anything special." Valdric said, "I know." He said it quietly. "That seems to be exactly it." There was a pause. Vesper looked at him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, which was genuine and unhurried and free of performance. She was not trying to interpret his visit strategically. She was simply looking at him as he actually was, a man who had come to a small office to explain something to a person a dragon had chosen, and who had revealed more of himself in the process than he had intended to. She said, "I've also been watching you. In the formal sessions, I have 3 years of notes." Valdric looked at her. "About me?" "About everything. But you appear regularly." She was not apologetic about it. It was simply true. She had been watching because she was curious, and she had written things down because that was how she thought. He said, "What did you write?" She reached past him, very calmly, and took her most recent journal from the windowsill. She turned to a page from 3 months ago and handed it across the desk. Valdric read it. His expression, which had been composed since he walked through the door, shifted slightly. What Vesper had written was precise and accurate, and also deeply kind, in the way of someone who had looked at a thing honestly without cruelty. She had written about the quality of his attention during long sessions, how he never stopped listening when petitions became repetitive. She had written about a moment when a young minister had made an error in a ruling, and Valdric had corrected it in a way that spared the minister public embarrassment. She had written, "I think he is careful with people, more careful than he lets them see." Valdric set the journal down. He looked at Vesper for a long moment. The precision he kept in his expression was still there, but it had opened toward her in a way that 20 years of careful calibration had not produced in any other room with any other person. He said, "There may be some protocol around what happens after Sorath makes this kind of recognition. I am honestly not certain. The records are not detailed." Vesper said, "I'll look into it. I'm good at archives." A pause. Then Valdric said, "I know you are." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the translation office, the Obsidian Court continued its ordinary afternoon. Attendants moved through corridors. Ministers reviewed documents. The great hall settled into its quiet between sessions. Vesper picked up her pen. She opened her personal journal to a fresh page. She wrote, at the top of it, in her small and even hand, "Today." And then she stopped and looked up at Valdric instead, because she realized that what was about to happen did not need to be written down in order for her to keep it. Some things are not reconstructed from notes. Some things stay on their own. Valdric watched her set down the pen. Something in his face, which had been precise and contained and carefully calibrated for 20 years, settled into a different position. Not a performance of ease, actual ease, the kind that cannot be scheduled. In the high gallery above the empty hall, Sorath rested along the stone railing in the late autumn light. Her ancient amber eyes were half closed. She had the particular stillness of something that has been waiting a long time, and has now, at last, seen what it was waiting for.